I still remember the first night I walked into the Lighthouse Grill as if it happened yesterday. The salty breeze from the Atlantic followed me through the door, carrying the distant cries of gulls and the faint rumble of waves colliding with the rocky shore below. Inside, the restaurant glowed with warm lights reflecting off the glass walls that faced the ocean. Every table was dressed in crisp white linen, the silverware lined up like soldiers ready for inspection. It was supposed to be a slow shift, or at least, that was what my manager had promised. But as the evening deepened and the sky outside turned a bruised purple, an unspoken tension settled over the dining room. The conversations grew quieter. The laughter from the bar stopped. Even the sound of clinking glasses faded. I didn't understand why at first, until the front door opened. A tall man in a dark overcoat stepped in, and the room seemed to contract around him. His presence was heavy, not in a physical way, but like a shadow that stretched over everyone else. The hostess straightened her posture but didn't meet his eyes. The bartender suddenly became fascinated with the bottles behind the counter. One of the waiters whispered something under his breath and disappeared into the kitchen. I glanced at my manager, confused, but he only gave me a look that was equal parts warning and surrender. Then he leaned in and whispered, "That's Ethan Whitmore. Don't drop anything, don't argue, and whatever you do, don't stare too long." I had heard the name before. In a town like ours, everyone knew who owned the string of luxury resorts that dotted the Maine coastline. The Whitmore name was stamped on glossy brochures, real estate ads, and charity plaques. People said he was ruthless in business, and he had the kind of wealth that could crush or save a local business with a single phone call. But this was the first time I had ever seen him in person. He removed his coat with deliberate slowness, and even from across the room, I could see the silver glint of his cufflinks in the dim light. He didn't look around the restaurant to see who noticed him. He didn't need to. Everyone noticed. His eyes, a pale gray that reminded me of the sea on a stormy morning, scanned the room like they were measuring its worth. Then, without a word, he headed to the corner by the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the water. Table number 5. My heart skipped a beat when my manager turned to me. "You're up," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Me?" My voice cracked before I could control it. I had been on the job for all of 2 hours. I barely knew the table numbers, let alone the unwritten rules of serving a man who clearly terrified the staff. "You're the rookie," he said, giving me a small, almost apologetic shrug. "He likes to see new faces. Go. And smile. A real one if you can." Every step I took toward that table felt like walking a tightrope over the ocean. The sound of my shoes on the polished floor seemed louder than the soft jazz playing in the background. When I reached the table, I noticed the ocean behind him first. Waves crashed against the rocks, and for a moment, I envied their freedom. Then he lifted his gaze from the menu he hadn't even opened yet, and his eyes met mine. It was like being caught in the beam of a lighthouse in the middle of a storm. Cold, sharp, and unavoidable. For a heartbeat, I forgot why I was there. "Good evening, sir," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. "My name is Claire, and I'll be—" He raised one hand slightly, a small, precise gesture that silenced me mid-sentence. His voice was deep, calm and commanding, the kind that made you straighten your spine without thinking. "Water. Room temperature, in a stemmed glass. No ice." I nodded quickly, clutching my notepad even though I hadn't written a single word. "Of course." As I turned to head toward the kitchen, I felt his gaze follow me like a weight between my shoulder blades. I had served my first instruction, and I hadn't dropped the glass or fainted. But as I disappeared behind the kitchen door, one thought settled in my chest like an anchor. This was only the beginning. By the time I returned to the dining room with his water, my hands had stopped shaking, but my heart hadn't. I carried the stemmed glass on a small tray, moving carefully through the quiet space. He sat perfectly still at table 5, the glow from the pendant lights catching the silver strands at his temples. He didn't look up as I approached, but I could feel his attention in the air, like static before a storm. I placed the water in front of him with both hands. "Room temperature, no ice," I said softly. He lifted the glass, held it against the light, and gave a small nod as if I had passed the first test in a series I didn't know existed. Then his voice rumbled low across the table. "I'll have the catch of the day," he said, "but grilled, no lemon, no butter, and make sure the skin is crisp. If it's soggy, I'll send it back." I wrote quickly, keeping my face neutral, but inside I was thinking, what kind of person orders fish with no lemon or butter? He wasn't finished. And the salad. No onions, no dressing, but a drizzle of olive oil. Extra chilled plate. He leaned back slightly. "Do you think the kitchen can handle that?" Something in his tone, a challenge wrapped in politeness, sparked an unexpected flare of boldness in me. Maybe it was exhaustion from a long day. Maybe it was pride. Or maybe I was just too new to know better. "I can ask them to ice the plate first," I said with a hint of a smile. "But I can't promise the fish will survive all those rules and still taste like fish." For a second, the world seemed to stop. A fork clinked at another table. A gull cried outside against the wind. Then, slowly, he lifted his eyes to mine. There was no anger there, just a cool, assessing look, like he was trying to decide what kind of creature I was. His lips twitched, almost imperceptibly. "I see," he said. "And what would you suggest then?" I hesitated for half a breath, but my voice was steadier than I expected. "I'd suggest letting Chef prepare it the way it's meant to be served. He's been cooking that fish for 20 years. He might know a thing or two about it." The corner of his mouth curved. Not a smile, not yet, but something close enough to startle me. "You're either brave," he said, "or foolish." "Probably both," I answered before I could stop myself. The air between us shifted, subtle but undeniable. I could feel the tension loosen just enough for me to breathe normally again. I jotted down his order and turned toward the kitchen, but as I walked away, I caught the faintest sound behind me, a quiet exhale that might have been the beginning of a laugh. Inside the kitchen, the head chef looked at me like I had carried a live grenade to his station. "Well?" he asked. "He wants the fish grilled, no butter, no lemon, crisp skin, and the salad. Let's just say it's more like a pile of cold lettuce." The chef groaned but started prepping without argument. "He's impossible," he muttered. I didn't disagree, but something about that brief exchange lingered with me. It was the way his eyes had shifted, the fraction of a second when the storm clouds cracked and let in a sliver of light. When I returned to the dining room, I passed table 5 and noticed him staring out at the darkening horizon. The ocean reflected the last streaks of sunset, and his reflection in the glass looked almost lonely. I refilled his water and said lightly, "If the fish comes out perfect, I get a gold star, right?" He turned, and this time, the hint of amusement was unmistakable. "We'll see," he said. It wasn't much, but it was the first crack in the armor of the man no one dared to face, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I felt a small, defiant spark of pride. The second time Ethan Whitmore walked into the Lighthouse Grill, I almost dropped a tray of water glasses. It had been 4 nights since that first encounter, and part of me wondered if I'd imagined the entire thing. The icy gray eyes, the impossible demands, the faintest curve of amusement when I dared to talk back. This time, he arrived earlier, just as the sun was sliding down behind the horizon, painting the sky in pink and copper. He wore a charcoal coat, his hair damp from the mist that rolled off the ocean. I noticed how the other servers tensed, the way they always did. then scattered into the kitchen to find tasks that didn't exist. He chose table 5 again, of course. The corner by the glass wall was his throne, with the restless Atlantic as his backdrop. I walked over, forcing myself to keep a steady pace. "Good evening, Mr. Whitmore," I said, and my voice didn't tremble this time. His eyes flicked to me briefly, then to the menu he still hadn't touched. "Water. Room temperature. Same as last time." "Yes, sir." I went to the kitchen, heart pounding with an idea that scared me more than his stare. Last time, I'd followed his rules. Tonight, I wanted to see if I could reach past them. When I was little, my mom used to make a creamy seafood chowder whenever a storm hit the coast. It was thick with potatoes, tender clams, and just enough bacon to smell like home. She would serve it with warm cornbread, golden and sweet, and say, "Food is how you take the cold out of a person's bones." Ethan looked like someone with cold in his bones. I asked Chef if I could bring out the chowder as an off-menu starter. He hesitated but nodded, muttering, "Your funeral if he hates it." When I placed the steaming bowl and the small plate of cornbread in front of him, he didn't speak. The smell of the sea and smoked bacon curled into the air between us. "This isn't on the menu," he said finally, his tone unreadable. "I know," I said, holding my breath. "It's my mother's recipe. I thought you might like to try something different." For a moment, all I could hear was the soft clink of his spoon against the ceramic. He took one bite. His expression didn't change. Another bite. Still nothing. My chest tightened. I wondered if I'd just crossed a line that could get me fired. Then he tore a piece of the cornbread, dipped it into the chowder, and paused as he chewed. Slowly, his gaze lifted to mine. "This is not bad," he said, which in his language might as well have been a standing ovation. Relief washed over me like the tide. "I'll take that as a compliment," I said softly. He set his spoon down, studying me for a moment. "Where did you learn to make this?" "My mom," I answered. "She used to cook like this whenever storms rolled in. Said it kept people warm from the inside out." For the first time, I saw a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "And does she still cook like that?" I hesitated. Number. "She's been sick for a while. These days, I do most of the cooking." He didn't offer sympathy, and I didn't expect him to. But he nodded once, as if filing that piece of me away somewhere behind those ice-gray eyes. When I walked back to the kitchen, the chef raised an eyebrow. "Well?" "He didn't hate it," I said, trying not to smile. "And he asked about my mom." It was a small moment, but it felt like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. For the first time, I wondered if the man everyone feared might be capable of something other than cold. After that second visit, something shifted between us. Ethan didn't suddenly become warm, but the silence around him changed. It was no longer the kind of silence that pushed people away. It was the kind that waited, curious, testing the air. He came back too, nights later, like clockwork. Table 5, the corner by the window, the Atlantic rolling under the moon. By then, I wasn't as afraid to approach him. My steps were still careful, but there was a spark of something else in my chest. A strange mix of defiance and anticipation. "Good evening, Mr. Whitmore," I said as I set down his water. His eyes flicked up. "Claire," he said. It was the first time he'd used my name. Hearing it in that low, steady voice sent an unexpected shiver through me. "Would you like the chowder again?" I asked. He nodded once. "And the cornbread." As I walked back to the kitchen, I glanced out the window. A single seagull perched on the railing outside, its white feathers glowing against the dark ocean. Its head tilted, as if it was watching the room. For some reason, the sight stayed with me. When I brought the chowder, he didn't dive in immediately. Instead, he leaned back slightly and said, "Sit for a moment." I froze. "Sit?" He gestured to the empty chair across from him. I'm the only table you're serving tonight, aren't I? I hesitated, then slowly lowered myself onto the edge of the chair, my apron brushing against my knees. It felt like stepping into another world, one I wasn't supposed to enter. He picked up his spoon and took a slow bite of chowder. You said your mother taught you this recipe. Tell me about her. The question caught me off guard. Most customers asked about the specials or the weather, not about the people who live behind the apron. I hesitated, then spoke quietly. My mom used to run a little bakery in town. Nothing fancy. Just pies, cookies, the kind of bread that makes the house smell like a hug. When I was a kid, I thought the smell of cinnamon meant home. His gaze stayed on me, calm but piercing. I found myself continuing. She got sick a few years ago. Her heart isn't strong, and the doctors said she has to slow down. So now I do most of the cooking. Some days, she sits by the window and tells me what to add to the dough. Other days, she just listens to the gulls in the ocean. The corners of his eyes softened, just slightly. It was the first time I saw something human slip past the polished steel of his expression. You live near the water? He asked. I nodded. Just a few streets away. You can hear the waves at night if the wind's right. My mom says the ocean talks to you if you listen long enough. He was quiet for a moment, chewing slowly. Then he said, My father used to bring me to a cliff near our old summer house. We'd sit there and watch the gulls circle. He said they only landed where they felt safe. I haven't thought about that in years. His voice had changed, lower, almost thoughtful, as if he was speaking to himself as much as to me. Another gull landed beside the first, fluffing its wings against the wind. The soft call echoed faintly through the glass, and for a moment, the two of us just watched in silence. Something fragile stretched between us then, like a thread you could see only in the right light. It wasn't friendship, and it wasn't anything like love. It was recognition. Two people carrying quiet weights, meeting at a table no one else dared to approach. He broke the silence first. You know, Claire, he said, most people try to avoid talking to me. They look at me and see a problem to escape. I met his gaze, steady this time. Maybe they never stayed long enough to see the person, not just the problem. His lips curved, barely perceptible, but I saw it. A small, careful smile that felt like a secret. When I returned to the kitchen, the chef gave me a questioning look. He talked to you? Yeah, I said, glancing back at the window where the gulls still perched. And for a moment, I think he actually listened. It didn't take long before Ethan Whitmore became a part of my weekly rhythm. Every Tuesday and Friday night, right around sunset, the bell above the restaurant door would chime, and the entire dining room seemed to hold its breath. By the third week, I wasn't afraid of that sound anymore. I almost expected it. Maybe even looked forward to it. He always chose table 5, the one pressed against the glass wall overlooking the restless Atlantic. Outside, gulls wheeled in the fading light, and the waves turned gold under the last touch of the sun. Inside, he would sit in the same chair, coat folded neatly over the back, eyes scanning the menu he never used. One Friday evening, I approached with his water before he even had to ask. He accepted it with a small nod and said, Thank you, Claire. Hearing my name in his voice had become something I noticed more than I wanted to admit. That night, the dining room was quiet. Only a few couples scattered around, their conversations low and private. I had time to linger by table 5 longer than usual. He broke the silence first. Tell me something, he said, leaning back slightly. If you could leave this town tomorrow, would you? The question caught me off guard. I held the tray against my hip and glanced out the window. The gulls were riding the wind, dipping and gliding effortlessly. When I was younger, I used to dream about leaving, I admitted. I thought if I could get to a big city, I'd finally feel alive. But now, I think I just want to have a place that feels like mine. even if it's small, even if it's here. He studied me in that quiet way of his, as if weighing the honesty in my words. A place that's yours, he repeated, not just somewhere you work or sleep. Yeah, I said softly. I want a kitchen that smells like cinnamon again. A window where I can see the water and know my mom is comfortable in the next room. I guess that's my version of leaving without leaving. His gaze drifted to the ocean, but something in his posture changed, shoulders easing, jaw unclenching. I followed his line of sight and noticed his left hand resting on the table. The silver wedding band caught the light. It was simple, scratched along the edges, the kind of ring that had lived a life. I hesitated but finally asked, "You still wear it?" He didn't look at me, not right away. "Old habits," he said. His voice was low, measured. "Some things are harder to take off than others." I thought about that, about the weight of memories and the things we carry even when we're trying to move forward. "I used to think memories were supposed to be light," I said quietly, "like the smell of fresh bread or the sound of waves, but sometimes they feel like anchors." That got his attention. He turned his head slowly, those pale gray eyes meeting mine with something almost human in them. "Anchors," he said. "That's a good word." For a moment, the only sounds were the hum of the overhead lights and the muffled crash of waves beyond the glass. The restaurant faded around us. It felt like the entire world had narrowed to this table, this window, and the soft glow of evening on his face. "Your mother," he said finally. "Is she doing better?" I shook my head slightly. Some days are better than others, but I keep hoping for more good days than bad. He nodded once. No empty promises, no pity, just a quiet acknowledgement that felt heavier than words. That night, after he finished his meal and left, I stayed by the window for a moment, wiping the table slowly. My reflection stared back at me in the glass, and behind it, the ocean stretched endlessly. A single gull landed on the railing outside, tilting its head at me before taking off again. I wondered if Ethan felt that same tug toward the horizon, the pull of something bigger than the walls we trap ourselves behind. The following Tuesday, the wind coming off the Atlantic was sharp enough to cut through my coat as I walked to work. By the time I stepped inside the lighthouse grill, my cheeks were flushed and my fingers stiff. The dining room was warm and golden, but I noticed something different right away. Ethan Whitmore was already there, sitting at table 5 with his coat draped over the chair beside him, staring out the window before the sun had fully set. He looked like he belonged to that view, stoic, immovable, like part of the rocky coastline itself. I approached with his water, but before I could set it down, he spoke. "Rough day out there," he said, his eyes still on the waves. I placed the glass in front of him. "The wind almost carried me away," I joked. "Guess I'm not as sturdy as those gulls." That caught his attention. He finally turned his gaze toward me, one eyebrow raised. "Gulls?" I nodded toward the glass wall. A handful of seagulls were coasting effortlessly on the updrafts, letting the wind toss them and then catching themselves at the last second. They always look so free, like they belong to the wind and the water, not to anyone else. I used to watch them for hours as a kid and imagine what it would be like to just lift off. His gray eyes lingered on me for a moment, then shifted back to the horizon. For the first time, he seemed to truly see the ocean instead of just sitting in front of it. "Freedom," he said quietly, almost to himself. "It sounds simpler than it is." I slid into the empty chair across from him, just for a moment. No one else in the dining room seemed to notice or care. "Maybe," I said, "but sometimes we make cages without realizing it. Work, fear, old memories. They keep us grounded even when part of us wants to fly." He was silent for a while, his gaze following a gull as it skimmed the edge of a breaking wave and then rose again, wings catching the light. I wondered if he was thinking about his life beyond the boardrooms and hotel lobbies. Finally, he said, "When I was younger, I thought freedom was power. Money. The ability to walk into a room and have everyone fall silent." He glanced at me with a shadow of a wry smile. I got that. And yet. And yet? I prompted softly. He exhaled slowly. "It feels lonelier than I expected." I didn't know what to say at first. I wasn't used to hearing him admit anything vulnerable. "Maybe that's why the gulls look so free," I said finally. "They travel in pairs. Or in flocks. Freedom doesn't mean much if you're completely alone in it." Something in his expression shifted. He leaned back in his chair, eyes returning to the sea. His left hand tapped lightly against the table, the old wedding band catching the fading sunlight. He didn't speak for several minutes, and I didn't push him. The light outside softened, turning the water into a mirror of liquid gold. The gulls circled once more and then disappeared into the distance, leaving a calm that pressed against the glass like a held breath. When he finally looked at me again, his eyes were different, less like steel, more like weathered stone, touched by warmth. "You talk like someone who's been waiting to fly for a long time," he said. "Maybe I have," I admitted. "Or maybe I just like to believe there's more than this little corner of the world." He nodded slowly, and for the first time, I felt a thread of hope in the air between us. Not the kind of hope that promised anything specific, just the quiet sense that a door had cracked open. When I left his table to refill another customer's coffee, I glanced back. He was still staring out at the ocean, hands folded loosely in front of him, and I realized he wasn't seeing just water and waves anymore. He was seeing possibility. The night he invited me into his world began with rain. It was a Friday evening, and the wind off the Atlantic howled against the glass walls of the lighthouse grill. Rain streaked the windows like silver, threads blurring the horizon into a dark, endless smear. Only a few brave customers had come in, and the dining room felt cocooned in warm light, the clinking of cutlery muted by the storm outside. Ethan Whitmore arrived without a coat umbrella, rain glistening in his hair and dripping from the cuffs of his suit. He shook off the storm like it was nothing more than an inconvenience, and as usual, the room seemed to shrink around him. But this time, something felt different. He didn't head straight for table 5. Instead, he paused in the doorway, scanning the room until his eyes found mine. "You're here," he said simply. "I always am on Fridays," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He hesitated for a moment, then walked toward me, his shoes leaving faint wet marks on the polished floor. When he reached me, he didn't ask for water or a menu. He said something I wasn't expecting. "Have you ever seen the ocean from my side of the cliffs?" I blinked. "Your side?" "My house," he clarified. "It's not far from here. The view is different." I hesitated, glancing at my manager behind the counter. He raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The storm had slowed business to a crawl, and I wasn't on the floor alone. Ethan read the question in my eyes. "It's just an invitation, Claire," he said. "You don't have to say yes." I don't know why I nodded. Maybe curiosity. Maybe trust. Fragile as a thread but still there. Maybe because I wanted to see the man behind the ice, and this felt like a door cracking open. His car was sleek and dark, the kind of vehicle that moved as quietly as a shadow. We drove through winding coastal roads, the headlights cutting through sheets of rain. I could hear the ocean roaring somewhere beyond the darkness, louder than I'd ever heard it. When we reached the house, my breath caught. It wasn't a mansion like I'd imagined, but a modern glass and wood structure perched on the cliff's edge. Warm light spilled from its wide windows, glowing against the stormy night. It looked like a beacon standing guard against the restless sea. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and salt. The space was open and uncluttered, filled with clean lines and muted colors. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the violent beauty of the Atlantic, waves crashing below like an untamed heartbeat. But what struck me most weren't the windows or the art on the walls. It was the photographs. There weren't many, but the ones that existed were carefully placed, on a mantel, a side table, the edge of a bookshelf. In every one, there was a woman, tall, graceful, with dark hair that caught the sunlight, and a smile that seemed both confident and kind. I glanced at Ethan, my voice quiet. "Your wife?" He nodded once, his jaw tightening. "Her name was Julia." He walked toward the largest window where the rain streaked down in uneven lines, and I followed. For a while, he didn't speak. The only sound was the storm outside, wrapping the house in a cocoon of wind and water. "She loved the ocean," he said finally. "She said it made her feel small in the best way. Like all the things we worried about were just ripples on the surface of something endless." I watched his reflection in the glass, the way his shoulders stiffened against a memory. "She died 3 years ago," he continued, his voice lower now. "A boating accident. I wasn't there. I was in a meeting 2 states away." He exhaled, slow and controlled. "I've built an empire, Claire. Hotels, resorts, private villas, but none of it could keep her safe. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't try to fill the silence with empty words. I just stood beside him, watching the sea crash against the rocks below. After a long moment, he turned to me. His face wasn't cold this time. It was raw, like the wind had finally stripped away the armor he wore in the world outside. "Sometimes," he said, "I come here and try to remember the sound of her laugh. The house is so quiet without it." I nodded, my throat tight. For the first time, I understood why he clung to table 5, why he wore that old wedding band, why his eyes carried storms that never seemed to break. Outside, a lone gull fought against the wind, wings spread wide. For some reason, watching it made me feel like I was standing in the middle of something fragile and real, a connection neither of us had asked for, but somehow both needed. The storm eased into a mist by the time we stepped onto the wooden deck that wrapped around his house. The boards were slick beneath my shoes, and the air was heavy with the scent of salt and rain-soaked cedar. Out here, with nothing but the railing and the open Atlantic below, the world felt exposed and untamed. Ethan stood beside me, his hands resting lightly on the railing, shoulders outlined against the dim glow from the windows behind us. The wind caught his hair, ruffling it in a way I'd never seen inside the restaurant. He didn't look like the man who could freeze a room with a glance. He looked human. "Do you ever get used to this?" I asked, my voice low against the roar of distant waves. He shook his head slowly. "Number. That's why I come out here. It reminds me that some things are bigger than me, bigger than all of this." He gestured toward the sprawling coast, the churning sea, the gulls riding the wind. We stood in silence for a moment, the mist cooling my cheeks. I shivered, and before I could react, he slipped out of his suit jacket and draped it over my shoulders. It was warm, faintly smelling of cedar and the faintest trace of his cologne. "Thank you," I murmured. When I turned to look at him, he was closer than I expected. His eyes caught the weak light from the house, softening the steel into something like weathered silver. For a second, I forgot about the cold, the wet, the storm, everything but the way he was watching me, like he was trying to memorize my face. "This is strange," he said quietly. "What is?" I asked. "Letting someone stand here, letting someone see me like this." He paused. "I don't do this, Claire. I don't let people in." I swallowed, feeling my heart thud against my ribs. Then why me? His gaze held mine, and for a heartbeat, the only sound was the wind. Because you don't flinch, he said. You see me, and you don't run. Before I could respond, he leaned in slowly, giving me every chance to step back. I didn't. Our lips met in a tentative kiss, soft and cautious, like both of us were afraid that too much pressure would break the fragile thread holding this moment together. For a few seconds, the world tilted. The cold air, the salt, the distant call of gulls, all of it blurred into something weightless. I could feel the uncertainty in the way his hand hovered near my shoulder but didn't quite grip, the hesitation in his breath against my cheek. When we finally pulled apart, I could barely speak. I should go, I said, though part of me wanted to stay right there, suspended in that fragile, stolen calm. He nodded, stepping back as if afraid to break the spell further. I'll drive you, he offered, but I shook my head. I like walking in the rain, I said with a small, nervous smile. The truth was, I needed the walk to collect myself, to figure out why my chest felt both heavy and light at the same time. He didn't argue. He just followed me to the door, opened it gently, and let the sound of the waves fill the silence between us. As I stepped out into the misty night, he said my name softly, once, like a question he wasn't ready to ask. I walked down the slick path toward the coastal road, the jacket still warm on my shoulders. The drizzle soaked my hair and ran down my face, mingling with the strange mix of excitement and unease swelling in my chest. Somewhere behind me, in that glass house perched over the Atlantic, a man with a storm in his eyes was standing alone again. And as the rain whispered around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stepped into something I didn't fully understand. Something beautiful, but breakable. The next morning, I woke to the sound of rain still tapping against my window. My clothes from the night before were draped over the chair, damp from the misty walk home. Ethan's jacket hung on the back of the door, carrying the faintest trace of cedar and salt. I stared at it for a long moment, the memory of his lips still a whisper on mine. There was a warmth in my chest I couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe. Or the fragile feeling that comes right before a fall. I went to work that evening expecting to see him. Every step from the staff entrance to the dining room was laced with anticipation. I smoothed my apron, glanced at the clock, and turned my eyes towards table 5. It was empty. That wasn't unusual. He didn't come every night. I told myself to be patient, that Friday had been extraordinary. People like him didn't just change their lives overnight. But the next night, the chair by the window stayed empty again. And the night after that. By the 4th day, I started to feel foolish for looking up every time the bell over the restaurant door chimed. I would glance automatically, my chest tight, only to see a couple in raincoats or a family with laughing children. The other servers noticed my restlessness. One of them, Jenna, nudged me as I wiped down a clean table. "Waiting for your VIP?" she teased softly. I forced a smile. Number just habit. But it wasn't just habit. It was an ache that grew sharper with each silent evening. The restaurant felt emptier without him, even when it was full. Table 5 was just a piece of wood and glass, but I caught myself polishing it longer than necessary, like it could summon him back. One slow Tuesday, I lingered by the window after the last diners left. Outside, the ocean rolled under a pale moon, the tide high and restless. Gulls perched on the rail, their white feathers silver in the moonlight. They didn't seem to care about absence or waiting. They simply were. I pressed my palm against the cool glass, a strange weight settling in my chest. Had I imagined everything? The warmth in his eyes, the hesitant smile, the kiss on that storm-wrapped deck. Was it only a fragile moment he had already locked away in some private vault? Work became mechanical. I took orders, refilled waters, smiled at strangers. But every night my eyes wandered back to table 5, and every night it stayed empty. On the 6th evening, I brought my mom a slice of pie after my shift. She was sitting by the window at home, wrapped in a quilt, the sound of the ocean drifting through the cracked pane. "You're quiet," she said, studying me with the kind of gentle knowing only mothers have. "Just tired," I said, though my voice didn't sound convincing. She reached over and touched my hand. "You can't wait for people to fill your life, honey. They come and go like tides. You've got to find your own shoreline." Her words settled deep, heavier than the salt air that clung to my skin. That night, lying in bed, I replayed the last time I saw him, the way he'd said my name at the door, soft and uncertain. I thought of the house on the cliff, the photographs of a life that had been shattered long before I ever stepped into it. And as the waves outside whispered against the shore, I realized the feeling in my chest wasn't just hope anymore. It was something sharper, the kind of ache that comes when someone leaves without a word, and you're left wondering if you were ever meant to stay. By the end of that week, I stopped glancing at the door every time the bell chimed. I told myself that waiting for someone who might never return was like holding my breath underwater. I could do it for a while, but eventually, I'd drown. One quiet afternoon, I passed the small storefront on Main Street that I'd been eyeing for months. The for lease sign was still in the window, swaying slightly in the coastal wind. The place was nothing special. Faded blue paint, scuffed hardwood floors, a cracked front window that overlooked a street of antique shops and cafes. But when I looked at it, I saw more than empty space. I saw a life that was mine. That evening, after my shift, I called the number on the sign. My hands trembled as I arranged a meeting with the landlord. 2 days later, I signed the lease and slid the deposit across the desk. The moment the key hit my palm, cool and heavy, something inside me shifted. The next morning, I unlocked the door to my own little shop. Dust motes swirled in the slanting sunlight. The air smelled like nothing and everything. Possibility, maybe. I dragged in a folding chair, a borrowed coffee maker, and my grandmother's recipe notebook. That first day, I baked a single batch of cornbread muffins in a small electric oven I'd hauled from home. The scent of butter and corn filled the empty room, curling around me like an embrace. I set the muffins on the windowsill to cool, the golden tops catching the light. For the first time in weeks, I smiled without thinking about who wasn't there to see it. In the evenings after my shifts at the Lighthouse Grill, I came back to the shop to scrub, sand, and paint. My arms ached, and my nails were perpetually dusted in flour or white primer, but it was a kind of ache I welcomed. Every stroke of the brush, every bag of sugar I stacked, felt like a brick in the foundation of the life I was building. There were nights when the loneliness settled over me like fog. I'd sit on the floor with my back against the counter, staring at the single string of lights I'd hung across the empty room. I thought of Ethan then, his quiet voice, the weight of his jacket on my shoulders, the way he'd kissed me like he was afraid of breaking. But instead of sinking, I let the loneliness push me forward. It reminded me that this space, this dream, was mine, not borrowed, not waiting for someone else to claim it. The first real test came on a rainy Thursday when I decided to make my mother's chowder and a small batch of cinnamon rolls for her to try. I carried them from the tiny back kitchen to the front, arranging them on a tray like I was already open for business. The smell of cinnamon, butter, and the faint brine of seafood filled the room. My mom sat by the window, wrapped in a scarf, watching the drizzle streak the glass. She bit into the muffin and closed her eyes. "Tastes like home," she whispered. I swallowed the lump in my throat. That's what I want this place to feel like. For everyone who walks in. That night, after I walked her home, I returned to the shop alone. The street was quiet. just the sound of distant waves and the occasional call of a gull. I leaned against the window, watching my reflection in the glass. Behind me, the little room glowed warm and golden. I realized that for the first time since Ethan disappeared, I felt steady. Not entirely whole, not entirely healed, but standing on my own feet. And for now, that was enough. The morning of my bakery's grand opening began with sunlight breaking through a thin veil of fog. Main Street was quiet, just the soft hum of early traffic and the distant rhythm of waves. I had spent the last week preparing every detail: freshly painted walls, the small chalkboard menu by the window, and the smell of cinnamon and warm bread spilling into the street. Mom sat by the corner table wrapped in her scarf, a quiet guardian in my little world. "You've done it," she said softly, her eyes glistening as she watched me set the last tray of muffins on the display. I smiled, though my stomach was a mess of nerves. "I've done something. We'll see if anyone shows up." She reached out and squeezed my hand. "Even if it's just one person, it's a start." By 9 o'clock, the bell over the door chimed for the very first time, and a pair of neighbors stepped in, bringing the smell of sea air with them. They congratulated me, bought 2 muffins, and left me feeling lighter than I had in weeks. Customers trickled in slowly after that. An elderly couple from down the street, a young mother with her toddler, a fisherman I'd seen at the docks. Each person took a piece of my dream with them, and I felt my heart swell. Then, around mid-afternoon, the bell chimed again. I looked up, ready to greet another stranger, and the words died in my throat. Ethan Whitmore stood in the doorway. He didn't look like the untouchable man from the restaurant anymore. His gray suit jacket was wrinkled, his tie slightly askew, and the faint shadow of stubble darkened his jaw. But it was his eyes that stopped me. Less like ice, more like tide water after a storm, carrying exhaustion and something like hope. In his hand, he held a small package wrapped in brown paper. And when the door swung shut behind him, I heard a faint clinking sound, like glass or metal. I froze behind the counter. My chest tightened with 100 unspoken questions, and the memory of weeks spent staring at an empty table 5. "Claire," he said quietly. My name sounded different now. Fragile, careful, like he wasn't sure he deserved to say it. I didn't move, letting him fill the silence. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, taking a hesitant step toward the counter. "I left without a word. I ran. It's what I do when something scares me. And you—" He stopped himself, looking down at the package in his hands. "You scared me because you made me feel alive again." The words hit me like a wave. I gripped the edge of the counter, willing my voice to stay steady. "You disappeared," I said softly, "and I felt like a fool for believing in whatever that night was." His shoulders slumped. "I know. And I hate that I hurt you. I went to the house on the cliff, stayed there for days, listening to the sea and thinking about all the years I spent locked behind walls I built myself. I thought walking away would protect me, but all it did was leave me emptier than before." He placed the package on the counter and carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a delicate wind chime, crafted from white seashells and tiny pieces of blue glass. At the bottom, a small silver gull spread its wings. "I saw this at a coastal market," he said. "It reminded me of the way you looked at the gulls that night. Like you understood something about them that I never could. I thought maybe, if you hang it here, it'll remind you that some things are meant to come back, even after they leave." My throat tightened, and for a long moment I couldn't speak. The soft tinkle of the shells in his hand was the only sound between us. Finally, I reached out and took the chime. My fingers brushed his, and I felt the warmth of him, familiar, yet hesitant. "Help me hang it?" I asked. He nodded, relief flickering in his eyes. We stepped to the front door and he climbed a small stool to hook the chime above the frame. When the next breeze slipped in, the shells sang a soft, trembling note, and the silver gull spun gently in the light. The sound filled the little bakery, delicate but sure, like the start of something I wasn't ready to name yet. I glanced at him, standing in my shop, looking at me like the tide had finally brought him home. And for the first time since that rainy night on the cliff, I let a spark of hope take root again. The wind chimes sang again as we stepped back inside the bakery, its soft tinkling floating after us like a whisper. I watched the silver gull spin in the sunlight, catching bits of blue and white from the glass pieces. It felt like the room itself had taken a deep breath. Ethan stood in the center of my little shop, his hands loose at his sides. For the first time since I met him, he didn't look like he owned the world. He just looked human, uncertain and a little tired, as if he'd walked a long way to get here. I motioned to the corner table by the window, the one I had secretly claimed as mine and Mom's, the heart of the bakery. "Sit," I said quietly. He obeyed without hesitation, lowering himself into the chair. I poured him a cup of coffee, the rich smell of roasted beans mixing with cinnamon and sugar in the warm air. When I placed it in front of him, he wrapped his hands around the mug like a man cold for a long time, warming slowly. For a while, we didn't speak. Outside, the wind pushed against the door, making the new chimes sing again. The sound was light, delicate, but it cut through the silence in a way that felt like a beginning. Finally, Ethan exhaled. "I don't know how to do this," he said, staring into his coffee. "Do what?" I asked. "This," he said, gesturing vaguely between us. "Let someone in. Care about someone. Every time I get close, my mind starts counting the ways it could go wrong." He paused, jaw tight. "I've spent years convincing myself I was safer alone, that I was better off with empty houses and quiet dinners, because if no one's there, no one can disappear on you." His voice dipped, and I caught the unspoken name in that silence. Julia. I leaned against the counter, my arms folded loosely. "Being alone might feel safe, but it doesn't keep you warm. Not really." He looked up at me then, and the steel in his eyes had softened into something weathered, vulnerable. "I was afraid," he said simply. "I still am. Afraid to want something that can be taken away again. Afraid to love someone and lose them." The words landed between us like pebbles in still water, sending quiet ripples through my chest. The wind picked up, and the shells outside chimed softly. I followed the sound to the window, watching the gull pendant sway in the breeze. There was something alive in that sound, a reminder that wind and water and time never stop moving, and maybe hearts weren't meant to stay closed forever either. I turned back to him. "I can't promise I won't leave someday," I said. "Life doesn't give guarantees, but I can promise I'm here now, and I won't run just because it scares me." Something in his shoulders eased, like a rope pulled too tight had finally slackened. He nodded slowly, taking a sip of coffee, his eyes never leaving mine. "Can I help?" he asked after a moment. I blinked. "Help with what?" "Whatever you need. Baking, cleaning, running errands. I don't want this to be—" He hesitated. "I don't want to just walk in and take up space in your life. I want to be part of it." I laughed softly, the sound surprising even me. I don't think I've ever imagined Ethan Whitmore in an apron. His mouth curved in the faintest smile. "I'll wear whatever you want if it means I can stay." The words weren't dramatic, but they felt truer than anything he'd said to me before. We spent the rest of the afternoon in a quiet rhythm. He refilled sugar jars while I frosted cinnamon rolls. The chimes sang whenever the wind swept down Main Street, a soft counterpoint to the clatter of utensils and the hum of the oven. Every note seemed to say, Something is alive here. Something has come back. When I closed up that evening, I walked him to the door. He paused under the chime, letting it brush his shoulder as it swayed. "Thank you for letting me in," he said. I looked at him, at the lines of exhaustion and hope carved into his face, and for the first time, I let myself believe that this, whatever it was, might be real. As he stepped out into the fading light, the chime rang one last time, and my heart answered. The first week after Ethan returned felt like a quiet miracle. He showed up at the bakery nearly every morning, helping me arrange muffins in the display, refilling the sugar jars, sometimes just sitting by the window with a cup of coffee while the seagull chimes sang above the door. For the first time in months, the space didn't feel so lonely. But in a small coastal town, nothing goes unnoticed. By the second week, whispers began to ripple through Main Street. I caught them in the grocery store, in the post office, even in the way people lingered outside the bakery window a little too long. "That's Ethan Whitmore, isn't it?" I overheard one woman whisper to another. "The hotel guy. With her?" Some said it with curiosity, some with judgment, and some with the sharp edge of envy. My chest tightened every time I felt their eyes on me, their glances flicking to the man who used to be untouchable, now casually tying an apron around his waist to help me carry a tray of bread. One afternoon, while I was kneading dough, I saw two teenagers press their faces to the glass, giggle, and run off. Ethan noticed my frown. "Are you letting them get to you?" he asked, drying his hands on a towel. "It's a small town," I muttered. "People talk. They think they know the story before it's even written." He studied me for a moment, then leaned against the counter. "And what do you think the story is?" I paused, my hands buried in flour. "I think it's a beginning, a fragile one, and I don't want to ruin it by listening to every voice but my own." The corner of his mouth curved slightly, the way it always did when my words caught him off guard. "Good," he said, "because I've been thinking about something bigger than whispers." I glanced up. "Bigger how?" "I want to help you expand," he said. "Not just this little bakery. I'm talking about a cafe by the pier, maybe even a seasonal pop-up in one of my hotels. People travel for food that feels like home, Claire. And what you're making here?" He gestured to the trays of warm bread and the cinnamon rolls cooling on the rack. "Is home. At least, it is for me." My heart skipped. Part of me swelled with pride, with excitement at the idea of growth, of possibility. But another part shrank back in fear. Expansion meant attention. It meant our lives, our connection, moving from the quiet safety of this bakery into the wider world where judgment lived. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," I said softly. He didn't push. Not right away. He just wiped a bit of flour from my wrist with his thumb, slow and careful. "You don't have to decide today. But I want you to know I believe in this. I believe in you." The warmth of his words clashed with the cold weight of the stares I'd felt all week. I wanted to hold on to the simple joy of these mornings, the sound of the chime, the smell of sugar and butter, the sight of him standing behind the counter like he belonged there. But my mind kept drifting to the outside world, to the whispers, to the invisible audience that seemed to follow us everywhere. That evening, after we closed, we sat together at the little table by the window. The gulls had settled on the railing outside, and the last light of day bled across the water. Ethan reached over and placed his hand over mine, warm and steady. "Claire," he said, "I've spent most of my life building walls, hotels, contracts, bank accounts. But none of it felt real. This, what we're doing here, it feels like the first thing that actually matters. I'm ready to build something real. With you." I looked out at the darkening sea and listened to the soft chime above the door. His words lit a small fire in me, one that fought against the fear and the gossip and the uncertainty. And for a moment, I let myself believe that we really could build something that would last, something that belonged to both of us, no matter who was watching. The morning after his proposal to expand the bakery, I woke before dawn and sat by my apartment window, watching the first streaks of light touch the Atlantic. I thought about his words, about the dreams he painted with that quiet certainty of his: cafes by the pier, pop-ups in his hotels, a brand that could stretch far beyond this small town. And I thought about my dream. It wasn't a chain of shops or a shiny logo. It was this little bakery that smelled like cinnamon and home. It was my mother sitting by the window with her scarf and tea. It was the gull chimes singing whenever the door opened. By the time I unlocked the bakery that morning, my decision had settled in my chest like an anchor. When Ethan arrived, carrying a box of fresh berries from a local farm, I met him at the counter. "I need to tell you something," I said. He raised an eyebrow but waited. "I can't expand. Not now. Not the way you imagine it. This place, it's enough for me. It's all I wanted. To make something small and real. Something I can touch every day without losing myself." He didn't speak at first. He just set the berries down gently and leaned on the counter, his face unreadable. "I see," he said finally, his voice low. "I thought bigger would make it better." "Sometimes bigger just makes it different," I replied. "I don't want to lose the thing that made this place special in the first place." The air hung heavy between us. I wondered if this would be the point where our fragile connection would start to fray. Then, slowly, he exhaled and nodded. "You're right," he said. "I've spent my whole life turning everything I touch into a project. I didn't realize I was doing it to you too." Relief rippled through me, soft and quiet. "I don't want to push you away," I said. "I just need space to grow at my own pace." He smiled then, small, but genuine, and it reached his eyes. "Then I'll learn to step back," he said. "I don't want to swallow your life to feel like I belong in it. I just want to walk beside you." The weeks that followed were a new rhythm, one we both had to learn. Ethan still came to the bakery, but he stopped trying to rearrange my world. He swept the floor, carried heavy bags of flour, and sometimes just sat by the window with a book, letting the gull chime and the smell of baking bread fill the air between us. There were mornings when I caught him looking at me, and instead of stepping in with plans or advice, he simply smiled and returned to his page. It was a quiet kind of love, the kind that didn't demand the spotlight. We started taking evening walks along the coast after I closed the shop. Sometimes we talked about nothing: sea glass we found in the sand, the way the gulls followed the fishing boats. Other times we talked about the lives we'd had before this. His filled with hotel boardrooms and silent penthouses, mine with secondhand cookbooks and long nights of worry by my mother's bedside. There was a freedom in those walks, a sense that we were learning to share the same horizon without trying to own it. One windy night, as we leaned against the railing overlooking the water, the gull chime from the bakery door echoed faintly in my memory. I realized then that love didn't have to be grand to be real. It didn't have to swallow us whole. It could simply walk beside us, leaving room for air, for breath, for the wind to move freely around the two of us. Ethan turned to me and said softly, "I'm learning to just be here, with you, without building anything but this." And in that quiet moment, with the sea stretching endlessly before us and the sky painted with the last light of day, I believed him. The bakery had grown into a small world of its own by late summer. The smell of cinnamon and butter greeted me each morning, wrapping around me like a well-worn quilt. Outside, Main Street hummed with lazy coastal life, seagulls calling above the harbor, the wind carrying faint scents of salt and seaweed. One Saturday morning, Ethan arrived early, carrying a small box under his arm. He had shed his suit for a soft gray sweater, and the way the morning sun hit his hair made him look younger, lighter. "What's in the box?" I asked, wiping flour from my hands. He placed it on the counter and opened it with a hint of ceremony. Inside were 3 small wind chimes, each different. One made of seashells, one of polished driftwood, and one with tiny metal tubes that glinted like morning light. "You only had one gull chime," he said. "I thought the shop could use a little chorus." I couldn't help but smile. "A choir of wind and gulls?" "Something like that," he said, and there was a warmth in his voice that once would have been unthinkable. We spent the morning hanging the new chimes along the awning outside the bakery. He held the step stool steady while I climbed, feeling the breeze off the ocean lift my hair. Each chime sang its own note when the wind caught it. The soft clink of shells, the mellow tap of driftwood, the clear ringing of the metal tubes. Together they became a soft, wandering song that blended with the calls of the real gulls overhead. When I stepped down, we stood side by side on the small wooden porch, looking out at the street, the harbor beyond it, and the wide sky that always seemed to be moving. The gull chime, the very first one he had given me, swayed gently near the door, the silver birds spinning in the light. For the first time since the night on the cliff, there was no undercurrent of fear between us. No second guessing, no half-buried tension. Just a calm that settled over my shoulders the way his jacket once had, warm and reassuring. He slipped his hand into mine, not urgent, not demanding, just there. I let my head rest against his shoulder. "Feels different now," he said after a long silence, his voice low enough that it nearly blended with the wind. "What does?" "This. United States. This place." He gestured to the little bakery, the chimes, the gulls. "I spent years thinking peace was something you earned by working harder, by owning more. But it was always just here, in the quiet, in the things you can't buy." I thought of my mother at the corner table, of the first muffins I had baked here alone, of the nights I had scrubbed the floor while wondering if he'd ever come back. All of it led to this porch, this breeze, this moment where nothing felt heavy anymore. "I used to think peace meant standing still," I said softly. "But maybe it's more like flying, letting the wind carry you without fighting it." As if to prove my point, a gull swooped low over the street, riding an invisible current with effortless grace. The chimes sang in response, their scattered notes chasing the bird down the street. We stayed on the porch for a long time, letting the rhythm of the town fold around us. Customers came and went, the bell above the door joining the wind's song. A little girl tugged her mother's hand and pointed at the spinning silver gull, giggling as it twirled. Ethan squeezed my hand gently. "You were right," he said. "About what?" "About not needing bigger," he said. "About this being enough." I turned to look at him, and there was no trace of the man who once sat behind table 5 like a stone fortress. There was only someone who had learned, at last, to stand in the wind without fear of falling. And in that soft morning light, with gulls in the sky and the music of chimes around us, I felt a new kind of peace. A peace that didn't ask for promises or proofs. It just was. Like the tide, like the wind, like the quiet understanding between two people who had finally found where they belonged. Sometimes, when I close the bakery in the evenings, I stand on the porch and listen to the wind chimes sing their soft, uneven song. The gull chime, the first one Ethan brought me, still sways by the door, its silver bird spinning slowly in the ocean breeze. From here, I can see the horizon, where the Atlantic folds into the sky. The same view I used to watch from behind a restaurant window, back when I was just a nervous waitress carrying water to table 5. It feels like a lifetime ago, but the memory is clear. I can still see that first night. The rain on the glass, the the weight of the tray in my trembling hands, and the man with the cold gray eyes who seemed carved from stone. No one wanted to face him. Everyone scattered. And somehow I was the one who stayed. I didn't know it then, but that small act, meeting his gaze instead of running, was the first step into an entirely different life. The path from that table to this porch wasn't straight. It wound through storms and silences, through a kiss on a rain-soaked deck, and weeks of staring at an empty chair. It carried me through loneliness that pressed like the ocean against the glass, and through the quiet triumph of unlocking my own bakery door for the first time. And it led here, this small wooden porch, where the air smells of cinnamon and salt water, and the man who once terrified an entire dining room now leans against the railing beside me with his sleeves rolled up, letting the wind touch him without flinching. Sometimes he talks. Sometimes we just listen. The gulls call overhead, the wind chimes answer, and the rhythm of the waves fills the spaces between words. It's a music I didn't know I needed until I heard it. Looking back, I realized the journey wasn't really about falling in love with Ethan, though that happened quietly, in the spaces between storms. It was about learning to face the things I was most afraid of: loss, vulnerability, the ache of hope, and to keep my heart open anyway. He once told me that fear made him build walls so high that even he couldn't see over them. I think I had my own walls too, only mine looked like routines and small, careful dreams. Meeting him didn't knock them down all at once. It just gave me the courage to open a door, to take one step out into the wind. Now, when I see the gulls riding the currents above the harbor, I understand what my mother used to mean when she said the ocean talks to those who listen. It doesn't speak in words. It speaks in movement, in patience, in the promise that tides go out and always come back. Life moves like that too. People leave. People return. Love isn't a straight line. It's a tide, a wind, a song in the air you can only hear if you stop bracing against it. As the sun sinks toward the horizon, painting the water in gold and copper, I rest my hand on the doorframe and take a deep breath. The air is cool, tinged with sugar and sea. Behind me, the bakery is quiet, just the hum of cooling ovens and the lingering scent of the day's work. Ethan steps onto the porch, his footsteps soft on the wood. He doesn't speak, and he doesn't need to. He just leans against the railing and looks out at the same horizon, the wind ruffling his hair, the chimes above our heads answering the evening breeze. I close my eyes for a moment and let the peace settle in my chest. Not the peace of stillness, but the kind that comes from knowing I can face whatever the wind brings: loneliness, love, change, and still keep walking. If you had told me back on that first night when I carried water to the man everyone feared that it would lead here, to gulls and chimes and quiet companionship, I might have laughed. Or maybe I would have dared to believe it, just a little. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is look someone, or something, in the eye and stay. And sometimes that's all it takes for the wind to finally carry you home.